Hi folks, we're going to talk about Tibetan Buddhism today, and I'll start right now. Basically, Vajrayana, which literally means the yana or vehicle of the Vajra, and Vajra either means lightning bolt or diamond. It has both those ideas. And think more about the lightning bolt when I tell you that it's also called the swift path and why. Okay, so we'll come back to that. So Vajrayana Buddhism, also known as Tantric Buddhism, also known as Tibetan Buddhism. All those three are synonymous. Okay? Now Vajrayana Buddhism grew out of Mahayana Buddhism. However, while Tibetan Buddhism, Vajrayana Buddhism is allied with many of the ideas that come out of the Mahayana tradition, it also involves some unique practices and finds its fullest expression only in the Tibetan orbit. Buddhism was introduced from India into Tibet in the 7th century CE. Okay, so pretty late in terms of the sort of Buddhist history. Now the world of Vajrayana practice is built on an intuition of the primordial, magical purity and sacrality of the phenomenal world, which brings with it an intuition of the inherent workability and transmutability of all human emotions and experiences. So basically what I'm trying to tell you here is that it's very different from the early Nikaya monastic Buddhism, because those guys basically figured, okay, you got to pull yourself away from society in general. You got to be off by yourself in a monastery before you can really start to realize and meditate and figure out how to think clearly, how to find what really is real. For people in the Tibetan tradition, you can be right in the messiness of the world, in the messiness of the jobs we have, the social interactions we have. But because of the fact that nothing has any inherent reality, every challenge that you might come across in your life can be transmuted into the wisdom of enlightenment. Okay? So that's what they're thinking. And also, the phenomenal world is seen as a sacred thing, being out in nature, being out in the world. And what you're going to find is that in religions that hold the earth to be a sacred place, women are often understood to be sacred too. And so there's going to be a relationship in the history of religions between religions that think the earth is a sacred place and that women, as sort of the fruit bearers of the earth, are also positive. So those two things, earth and women, when they're positive, when one is seen as positive, the other is seen as positive. When the earth is seen as negative, women are usually seen as negative. Okay? So Vajrayana Buddhism includes an abundance of positive feminine images and symbols, as well as a significant number of women practitioners. Both those who grew up and are part of a monastic tradition and become enlightened teachers in Tibetan Buddhism, and lay people. However, the mythic and symbolic representations of women in Tibetan Buddhism coexist with a social reality that sharply limits women. And I think I told you during the residency, but I'll tell you again, the word woman in Tibetan is literally translated as born low. So that's a bummer. All right? But, as I said before, Tibetan Buddhism, in the texts of Tibetan Buddhism, women are seen as fully able to reach enlightenment, and you have a lot of positive images of women. Okay, now in Tibetan Buddhism you have a really interesting phenomena, which is the practice of reincarnated lamas or teachers, right? And great teachers are seen to be successively reincarnated. Okay, and these reincarnations for the big positions, the highest positions in Tibetan Buddhism, they're almost always looked for in men. So that's one reality. But it's a very interesting way of seeing your tradition by saying that, okay, this great leader is going to be reborn again here on earth, and we're going to be able to find him. Okay, what that does is it lends an almost unbroken chain of leadership that acted to really strengthen Tibetan Buddhism. Okay, this, because they can, it's like the CEO of a company. If when that guy retired or died, if you could say, but he's going to come back and he's going to be over there, you would have a very, very strong leadership lineage, and that's what you have in Tibetan Buddhism. There's a really terrible movie with Keanu Reeves about Buddhism, but one of the things that's kind of cool about it is that it shows the way that this tradition works. And one of the ways it does work is like this. Oftentimes, it comes right out of the idea that a bodhisattva is one who will continue to come back and back and back until all sentient beings are enlightened. And for Tibetan Buddhism, the idea is that a lama who knows that they're shortly going to leave this earth, they can tell those around us, hey, look for me here in Sikkim or in this province. And then once that lama dies, other lamas that know that teacher will start to have dreams and say, I had a dream that we would find our next great teacher here behind a river or here in this kind of house. And so the leaders of Tibetan Buddhism are kind of directed, self-directed, or directed by objective reality to find the next incarnation. And then once they think they've found a little being for whom the spirit of that Buddha has moved into, then they will test to see if the child recognizes anything of their prior possessions, or if the child shows an amazing ability for languages, or for enlightened thought, or any of those kinds of things. So these tests go on. Now, are they fixed? Well, if you're a skeptic, you could say that this was a great system to be able to manipulate in order to have those in power who you want in power. At the same time, it lends itself to a very strong system too. So both those things are going on, and we can discuss it at a later date whether or not you think that's a fixed game. I will tell you this though: the Chinese government, during the times that they have taken over, have tried to set up a system in which you pick basically the name out of a bowl of who will go on to be the next leader in Tibetan Buddhism. And that system, right, where you drew a ball out of a bowl that then told you it's going to be this guy or that guy, the Tibetans very much thought that the Chinese were rigging the deal when they were using that process. So anyway, in 1959, as many of you know, the Chinese government moved in to occupy Tibet. And at this point, many Tibetan Buddhists, including the Dalai Lama, and the Dalai Lama is the head of Tibetan Buddhism, the religious head of this monastic tradition in Tibet. And it's also a monastic government, or was until the Chinese moved in, because the Dalai Lama was both the head of state and the head of the religious tradition. Okay, but in 1959, and I'm sorry, one other thing. Dalai Lama literally means ocean of wisdom. It's a Mongolian word. The Mongolians and the Tibetans were very tight while Tibetan Buddhism was getting underway. Okay, so in 1959, the Chinese government moved in to occupy Tibet. At this point, many Tibetan Buddhists, including the Dalai Lama, left Tibet in order to escape persecution. The Dalai Lama, who is the 14th incarnation of this personage, okay? The present Dalai Lama, the 14th, resides presently in northern India, in Dharamsala, India, which is way in the north, along with many other prominent Tibetan Buddhists. Their escape was essential, for the initial policy of the Chinese government was complete genocide. And an enormous number of monasteries and shrines, texts, and religious sites were destroyed in 1959. What few monasteries that were left have lost all the political power they once had and have been reduced to performing a selected number of religious ceremonies. But no other activities are allowed, and thus no intellectual support is forthcoming. Tibetan Buddhism thus is said to exist in diaspora. It has been dispersed throughout the world. And one of the things that's just amazing about the present Dalai Lama is that this is a guy who lost his homeland, who saw horrible genocide visited upon the Tibetans by the Chinese. However, when he talks about this, he talks about the fact that we can forgive, but we will never forget what the Chinese brothers and sisters did to us, and also sees the fact that Tibetan Buddhism is now in diaspora. He sees that as a wonderful spreading of the word of Tibetan Buddhism. So that's really looking on the bright side, is what that is. So here are the points at the heart of Tibetan Buddhism. Okay, let me say this first. As we talked about in our last lecture, right, you got Mahayana Buddhism, and then you've got two streams. The first one, or one of them, follows into the Pure Land tradition, which sets up a dualism between Pure Land Buddhas and you. In other words, there's these entities out there that magnetize you and pull you into the Pure Land. And that's following a dualistic path. We talked about with the dragon princess, the Nagi princess, that basically you have to turn into a man before you can head up to the Pure Land. And once in the Pure Land, that's where you gain enlightenment. Okay, so Tibetan Buddhists follow the second path down. And we'll remember that the second path down, like the Madhyamikas and the Yogacharans, these guys are all understanding that there is no dualism. There is no dualism. There is no essential beingness to anything. And that as a result, you must depend on your own meditative efforts to gain enlightenment and to become one with everything. You can't rely on somebody outside or a Buddha outside. So the Tibetan Buddhists follow that same path. They are non-dualistic. And so in places like when they talk about prayers in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, you're not praying to something outside. You're praying to realize enlightened energy and therefore be directed toward enlightenment. Okay? So at the heart of Tibetan Vajrayana Buddhism, Vajrayanas believe that you can attain enlightenment within one lifetime. Okay? The Mahayana schools, for the most part, don't believe this. They believe that it takes lifetime after lifetime after lifetime. And the Nikaya Buddhists believe the same thing. But the Tibetan Buddhists believe that you can, even if you're living a crappy, terrible life, you can turn it around in one moment of enlightened thought. And that's why it's called sudden enlightenment. They believe in sudden enlightenment. They believe that meditational instruction and practice are crucial to this process of enlightenment. So a big focus on meditational practice. They believe that everyone has the Tathagata Garbha, the embryo of the Buddha inside them, and that all of us have this Buddha nature, have an unsullied Buddha nature. And because of that, that's why you can get suddenly enlightened. They see the connection there, because if you have it already inside you and it's only gotten a bit covered up with kind of bad thoughts and bad actions, you can snap out of that because you have whole within you this innate Buddha purity. Okay? And Tibetan Buddhism is very result-oriented, which means that rather than seeing Buddhism as something to strive for, you see yourself as already there. You are a Buddha. You use Buddhist principles to further your own Buddha nature, but you can attain enlightenment, all of us, in this single lifetime. Okay, so that's your lecture for today. And have fun working with the Tibetan Book of the Dead.